Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on all orders over $10 and support the channel at the same time. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 4 of our 6-part Masters 25 full set review, where we're going to take a look at all of the red cards in the set, as well as a few of the multicolor cards. Now, if you've been watching this series, you kind of know what to expect here. We are talking about limited, draft, and sealed strategies. These are all reprints. We kind of know what they do in constructed formats, maybe with the exception of some of the cards that are new to Pauper for the first time. But for today, we're going to be talking about limited strategy. Now, quickly before we get started, though, just a really quick reminder. If you check out the description below, you'll find a few ways to help support what we do here at the channel. You'll find our Patreon page link there, as well as links to products on Amazon. If you make any purchases on Amazon, once you go through that initial link, we'll get a small percentage for the channel. And then finally, Flipside Gaming still offering a promo code for our viewers. Maybe save some cash and support the channel at the same time. They have Masters 25 as well as a number of other products available. Now, with that being said, thank you again, and let's get into the review. We'll start off again by talking about some of the dual color strategies that you'll find for archetypes with red. This is very important information for draft, but I think it's still really important for sealed as well, even though you might not have a fully formed like dual color deck or something like that necessarily as much in sealed. Still good to know the synergies. So we already mentioned in the first video the synergies between white and red. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but long story short, white is kind of a white weenie, a little bit of token generation, allows you to go wide. Red is, of course, another color that's going to give us a lot of small creatures and back it up with some direct damage. So they complement each other really well if you want to go for an aggressive go wide style deck. Secondly, we've already discussed blue and red, of course, in part 2. So again, I'll go through it quickly. Basically, it's going to be a control deck with a lot of burn backup, maybe a few small creatures to get some early damage across and keep the damage coming as you control the board state. It's not as much a spell matters style deck as sometimes it is in these limited formats. However, there are a couple cards we'll see today that do fit into that formula, but it's not a like full-on 100% archetype this time around. This is more of a classic control burn style deck. Red-black, which we talked about yesterday, is also very aggressive, but there's a little bit of a twist to it. It starts off as an aggressive deck, playing a lot of small creatures, pushing damage across, some evasion through fear and stuff like that. But then later in the game, when maybe you start to run out of gas, there are sack outlets where you can get abilities for sacrificing maybe some of your creatures that are now obsolete. And finally, we have red-green, which we haven't discussed yet. Those are the Gruul colors. Kind of the stompy colors. I mean, you get some bigger creature options now in green. So you can have a nice curve where you start off with some small red creatures. In the middle of the game, use your burn and try to clear the path for some of your larger win conditions that could come out later in green. That's one way to go with it. Green also offers some ramp, which can be useful at times too, but they do complement each other really well, considering the very solid curve they can create, as well as some of the backup damage spells. Alright, with that being said, let's get into the individual cards for the day. We're going to start off with Active Treason. Now, if you've never played with Active Treason, it's actually a very good and versatile card. Here's what I love about it. I mean, you're stealing one of your opponent's creatures, you're using it for a turn to attack in or what have you. And do note one thing, though, that this doesn't have to be on an opponent's creature. A lot of these type of spells sometimes will say gain control of target creature and opponent controls. This one does not. It says target creature. So in a pinch, if you just need to untap one of your creatures or give a creature who just played haste, you can actually do that with Active Treason. So don't forget that. It's very important. Aside from that, though, typically you're going to be using it in the more traditional way where you're stealing the creature and then using it against your opponent. Keep in mind, too, in black, there's a lot of sack outlets. So if you're in Rakdos, this card gets maybe just a little bit better because you can steal the creature, attack in, and then sacrifice it for a benefit, and that's a really big play, actually. There's also one Boros colored card we'll look at later that is a sack outlet as well, so you'll want to remember that in your drafts. Akroma, Angel of Fury. This is one of the mythics, and this one, you know, is not the hardest thing to get on the battlefield. I mean, hard casting, it could be difficult. 3 red and 5, of course. But if you can morph it and protect it and then later do 3 red and 3, that's not that bad, actually. Now, it is heavy red, so know your deck. Make sure you're going to be able to swing a triple red spell, because if you can't, you're going to want to skip this one. You don't want this stuck in your hand necessarily. Although, if it is, you can still use it as a 2/2 creature if you really needed to. So I guess it's not the end of the world. But I'm probably playing something better if I'm in less than a 40% red deck, I would say. I wouldn't risk it at that point. Now, once you do get this thing out, I mean, it is a powerhouse. Flying trample, protection from white and blue. If you hard casted it, it can't be countered, which is nice. Also has fire breathing on top of everything, and it's a 6/6. So this thing is going to really be a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Yeah, it can still be taken out with black removal or something like that, and you have to plan for it, but you know what? Make your opponent work for it, because if this thing gets out there, they need to have an answer, or else they're probably in a lot of trouble. Now, aside from that, you can also maybe cheat this thing into play sometimes. You do have some recursion effects in black especially, and you don't necessarily even have to be in Rakdos colors to use those. For example, you could be in a deck that's not running red at all, and you're just running the black recursion spells. If you can find a way to get this into your graveyard and reanimate it, you don't need to cast it for any red mana, right? And in a pinch, you could even use it as a morph creature if you needed to. Also, we haven't looked officially at the card yet, but green has Elvish Piper, which would work as well. You won't see this card very often, obviously. It is a mythic, but it's a good one if you can get your hands on it. Balduvian Horde. Okay, this one is one of the many cards in red, actually, that has been introduced to Pauper through this set for the first time, as this gets busted down to common from rare. This used to be a rare back in its day, and it was actually a good rare when it was in standard, believe it or not, because the game was very different back then. And it was hard to find large creatures at decent casting costs. So if you get a 5/5 for 4, even with this drawback, you were probably really happy, and the card was strong. Nowadays, things are different. However, in this limited environment, it kind of harkens back to those days, and this card is not bad at all, as a matter of fact. It is hard in the set to find sizable creatures at common and uncommon. And green's a little better at it, but most colors are going to struggle, including red. So when you have an opportunity to get a larger creature at a lower rarity level, maybe in a draft or in your sealed pool, that's going to be good for you. Now, here's the problem with the card, though. Here's the flip side. It is card disadvantage at its heart. So it's okay in some aggro decks, which is what red's trying to do, maybe the Boros or Rakdos aggro, because you start off with a lot of small creatures, you get to the middle portion of the game, and you need a little bit of heft on the battlefield as you're starting to run out of gas because maybe your opponent's got a good blocker or something. This can come in for you and give you that heft, and I do like that. But I'm only going to put one in my deck probably because I don't like the random card disadvantage. If I have to discard something, that's bad enough because it's already card disadvantage. But at random, it might hit something I really care about or want to hang on to, like a removal spell. That could get kind of awkward for me, and at times I might decide I might not even want to take the risk by playing this, and that's kind of weird. So you don't want to be in that situation all too often, but I do think there is some utility to this card, in especially this set and in red. So it is playable, but just don't go crazy with it. Ball Lightning. All right, you want to talk about pushing damage across fast. Ball Lightning can do that for you. It is 3 red, so again, kind of like I was saying about a Chroma, make sure you feel comfortable casting 3 red in your deck. But if you do, this is going to be fine for you. It doesn't help you with your board presence that much, but that's not what this card's about. This card's about going super aggro and pushing damage across. 6/1 haste, you do have to sacrifice it if it survives even at the end of the turn. However, there are some tricks you can use, especially again if you're in Rakdos colors, where you can maybe sacrifice this and get some other benefit out of it by the end of the turn. Or you could bring it back once or twice even over the course of a game with Hell's Caretaker. That could be a pretty interesting play and could lead to a lot of damage. So there's ways to make this even better if you're in the right synergies. Blood Moon. Okay, Blood Moon is more of a sideboard card, I guess. I mean, this is more for constructed Magic than it is limited Magic. And there's not a lot of like color fixing lands necessarily in the set. You have the filter lands, but they're rare, and I don't think they're going to matter enough for you to want to bring in Blood Moon most of the time. This is really if you run into a problematic land that's really bothering you, like Rashad Import, for example, then maybe you side it in. Other than that, you're not going to play this all that much in limited. Browbeat. Browbeat is actually a really good card, even though it's one of those cards that gives your opponent an option, which I usually don't like, but these options are kind of bad either way that you look at it. And this actually has some versatility because in a pinch, you could even use this to perhaps damage yourself. There's a lot of cards in red that you could damage yourself with. You might ask yourself, well, why would you want to do that? There's not a lot of reasons, but like if you had Darien in white, which allows you to gain soldier tokens based on how much damage you take, well, I don't know, maybe that could be important. So keep that in mind always. Remember to think out of the box with a lot of these cards, especially older cards give you more opportunities to do that than newer cards. But with that being said, this card in particular, if you're just playing it the normal way, is still really good. For 3 mana, your opponent has a tough decision to make. They're not going to want to give you 3 cards, so they're going to lean towards taking the 5 damage. 5 damage is a significant chunk, though, especially if you have an aggressive build. Again, especially good for Boros or Rakdos. So if you have this aggressive build and they want to keep you off the card draw, they're going to be in trouble because they're going down to virtual 15 life, and that could be an amount of life that is really not sustainable against a good aggro deck, right? So some of the time they're going to have to give in and let you draw the cards, and that's also really, really, really good for you. So either way, they're just kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Chandra's Outrage. Really good removal spell here. It hits a creature for 4 and then also does 2 to the face to the creature's controller. So very good. Again, it can target anything on the battlefield. Always keep that in mind. Sometimes that will be relevant, but most of the time you're just going to use it against your opponent. What really pushes this card over the top for me, though, is the fact that it's an instant. That's phenomenal. It's going to be great for you in the Izzet decks, especially because blue is very draw-go. They don't want to show too much on their turn, so they have the turn where they don't need to counter something and there's an opponent's creature on the battlefield they want to deal with. Yeah, they can use this at instant speed and deal with it. That's actually pretty sweet. I've said it all week, but I love these land cycling cards. This is Chartooth Cougar, and maybe not as good as some of the others we looked at just because the creature base isn't quite as strong as some of the others, but I'm still really happy to play these because that mountain cycling can be super sweet and smooth out some opening draws. Many times you look at your hand, you got 2 lands, which might not be as big of an issue for red than other colors, but let's say you have 2 lands and you really have some things that cost a little more in your hand that would have been a mulligan, but you have this in your hand. Now all of a sudden it's a keep, or you have 2 lands but you have no mountains. All of a sudden, if you got this, again, a mulligan turns into a keep. That's awesome. The creature itself's fine. I mean, a 4/4, again, at common is not a bad thing, especially in this environment. So having a 4/4 gives you some heft. It's going to cost you 6, so it's a little bit of a heavy resource burning card considering what you're getting. But it has fire breathing as well. That's not the worst thing in the world. So I play it really because of the mountain cycling, but it's not a bad creature either. Cinder Storm. This is another card that's coming to Pauper for the first time. Really good direct damage spell here that can hit player or creature. It's costing you a little bit at 7, but at least it's not dual red, which is kind of nice. You can even splash this thing. But what I like about this, again, the aggressive builds that put across the early damage, sometimes they struggle with the late damage or the late portion of the game. They kind of run out of gas. This is going to push across 7 more damage maybe at the end of the game and finish it off for you, which is kind of awesome. And in a pinch, you can deal with a problematic creature too if you're really in trouble there and your opponent has a lot of life left. But really strong card for those Boros and those Rakdos decks especially. Crimson Mage, another card that's coming to Pauper for the first time. Just so many of these in red. This one is a great aggro card. It's a good aggro body on its own, a 2/1 for 2. You don't see a lot of 2/2s for 2 in this set, by the way, like you do in contemporary Magic. A lot of your 2-drops are 2/1s, but that's okay, especially for red's purposes. This one being a 2/1 just can attack in, that's great, but that ability though, anytime you play a creature, if you have an extra red, they can attack the turn it comes into play, can be hyper critical, again pushing across late game damage. Eidolon of the Great Revel, classic burn aggro card that you see in a lot of constructed Magic. Really great reprint here. Works just as well in a burn aggressive deck in limited. So if you've never played a lot of that type of style deck, you might kind of say to yourself, well, I mean, this would hurt me as well. A lot of my red cards aren't going to cost more than 3, so why would I play this? Well, the bottom line is what this does for you is it gives you a 2/2 body for 2, which is kind of nice, even though it is 2 on color. Now, yes, you're going to be taking some damage from the stuff you're going to be playing, but the idea is you're going to be burning your opponent. So for that lightning bolt that's going to be doing 2 damage to you, it's going to be doing 3 damage to your opponent, for example. So you're basically racing. You're banking on the fact that when the opponent plays something small, they're going to have to take some damage or really have to think about their plays going forward. When I play something small, I'm going to take some damage too, but I'm outpouring more damage faster in a shorter window of time. So it's all about racing, and this card is very, very good at getting you there. Another way you can look at this too is even if I'm not in an aggro build like Boros or Rakdos, maybe I'm in Gruul and I just have larger spells, just generally. Maybe I'm ramping into stuff. Then perhaps I'm just banking on this hurting my opponent more than it hurts me. Enthralling Victor, a little more contemporary card here. It does only let you target an opponent's creature this time around, but it does let you steal a small creature from them, attack in with it, and it's a 3/2 body for 4, so you're getting a lot of value here for 4, and it feels pretty good to run. This is an uncommon. Again, you'll maybe grab 1 or 2 of these in a draft, and that should be sufficient for you. Also remember, if you're playing with black, or the card we're going to see in a moment in Boros colors, you could have some sack outlets too, which makes this even better. Fortune Thief. I feel like this would have been the spot for Ali from Cairo. Of course, that's on the reserve list, so instead we get Fortune Thief. Ali from Cairo felt very nostalgic. This card maybe doesn't have that same feeling for a lot of people, but it does something similar. Now, as a matter of fact, you could argue that this could be more interesting some of the time because of Morph. Now, Morph does fall in all the colors in this particular set. However, blue and red have a lot of Morph opportunities, so you can fool your opponent a little more if you're in those colors. And if you maybe take something that would have been lethal damage and you Morph this, you can surprise your opponent a little bit, maybe crack back and like steal a game from them. Or if they burn something like a Cinder Storm or something like that, you can save yourself. You're still at 1, but, you know, maybe you survive the next turn or something. And because of that, I find the card at least interesting. I don't know if I always play it, though, honestly. Especially if I'm in red, I want to be more aggressive 99% of the time. So this card isn't a very aggressive card. Granted, it's still a 2/2 for 3, which isn't the worst thing if you play it for the Morph cost. But at the same time, do I want to take pressure off to defend myself like this? I don't know if I want to do that, because if my deck's running the way it should be running, I should be outpouring damage pretty fast, and I don't have to, hopefully, worry about being down to 1 or 2 points of life, right? It does allow me to get more aggressive sometimes, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if I'm too worried about, say, crackback, and sometimes that is a problem for these aggro decks. But at the same time, with the 1 toughness, it's so fragile that I wouldn't trust it. Like, I couldn't use this just as a safety net. My opponent blows it up, and then I lose the game, right? So, yeah, it kind of is what it is. I don't think this always makes your build. Every once in a while, it might be fine, though. Frenzied Goblin, another card that is being introduced to Pauper for the first time. And this is great for aggro builds. It's cheap, it's a 1/1. It can put across early damage, but maybe more importantly, when your opponent gets to the mid-game and they start putting out some substantial blockers that slow down your game, this keeps you pouring on damage at least for 1 more turn. You make that creature unable to block and you get in there. And if you can grab a couple of these, that could be very powerful for you in an aggressive build. Again, this is going to be best in like Boros, where you have a lot of small creatures and you're going wide and you need to keep them alive and still pour damage on. Good in Rakdos too, which is doing some similar things. But fantastic aggro card here. Genju of the Spires. This is a fine card. Like, it's better in some matchups than others. What I don't like about this particular enchantment is the fact that there's so many go wide and small creature strategies in this set that a lot of times this is not going to feel good for you. Now, on the flip side, the positive is a lot of times in aggressive builds, you get mana flooded a little bit, and if you draw too many lands, this at least gives you something to do with those lands, and that could be good. So, under certain circumstances, yeah, I'll play this, but I could see myself sideboarding it out if I'm against white or red, or even some of the token generation you might even find in green. All of a sudden, this becomes a little bit worse and doesn't do enough for you, I don't think. Aside from that, though, if I'm up against, I don't know, Dimir, Simic, maybe I sideboard it in those cases because it might be stronger if your opponent has less creatures, even if they are more substantial. I also like the fact that when the mountain goes to the graveyard, this does get to go back to your hand. It is a May ability, so don't forget to do it. But it does go back to your hand, which means you won't always get 2 for 1 if someone has like a removal spell. It can still be disenchanted, though, of course. Goblin War Drums. Now, this is a great aggro card. You might glance at this and say, well, you know, why would I want to play an enchantment on turn 3 or turn 4 as opposed to playing another creature if I'm in aggro? And I would say, yes, you are correct. You probably want to just play the other creature. But later in the game, when your opponent starts to put down those blockers and you can't get that last few points of damage across and you start to run out of gas, this is a nice play. Giving all your stuff menace, sometimes that can help you close out a game. It's actually a very powerful card. Hordling Outburst. Okay, another common that is coming to Pauper for the first time. This is a way to generate some tokens in red. There's not really a goblin tribal theme in the set. There's some goblins, which play well to basically the aggro nature and the fact that they're small creatures, but there's not really like a goblin lord or anything like that, unfortunately. However, if you're trying to go wide, this is going to be a fine card for you. This is probably better in Boros, though. If you're playing with white cards, there are some white cards that can pump the team a little easier. There's one really good one in red we're going to see in just a moment, but you see a little more of that in white, so I think this can be more potent there. Humble Defector. There's not a lot of ways to draw cards in red, but there's a couple, and this is a pretty good one, actually. I would say that if you're trying to play fair with this card, it's still good. It's a 2/1 for 2, so again, it can get in there and rumble in those aggro decks, and sometimes it will need to do that. But if you want to draw some cards and just keep the hits coming, which again, aggro needs to do, it needs a little bit of card draw behind it a lot of times so it can keep the gas coming, then this will be good for you. And here's the real trick. If you don't have a trick to this card, which I'll talk about in a second, you want to make sure that you're getting more of a benefit from the card draw than your opponent will. So in other words, if I'm in the aggro deck and I need to keep drawing gas, that might be more important than my opponent drawing 2 cards if they're in like a green black deck or something like that, where they may have some higher casting cost stuff. Yes, they're drawing cards, and that's never good, but at the same time, their hand might get clogged up a little bit, as opposed to mine, where I'm just dropping a lot of like 2-drops and such. So that's one way to look at this card. The other way is just play this in Rakdos colors, tap it, draw your 2 cards, sacrifice it, and then the opponent never gets it. Yes, it actually works, because you can put the ability on the stack, you'll still draw the cards, and then you don't have the card anymore in play to give to your opponent, so they never get their opportunity. And then recur it with like Hell's Caretaker or something and do it again. Actually, 2 of these in Hell's Caretaker, and you're probably having a pretty good day. As a matter of fact, that's not impossible, because the Caretaker's rare, but these are just uncommon. Also, one last thing to think about with this card, I mean, you don't even have to get that fancy, honestly. I mean, just simply a removal spell. Just tap it, and if you have instant speed removal like a Lightning Bolt, you'll also get the same kind of advantage. It's maybe not as economical, though. Imperial Recruiter. This one's a mythic, and if you don't know the history of this card, you might look at this and be like, why is this thing a mythic? And it's not ultra powerful. No, it's not. It is a tutor effect, though. Even though it is very restricted, tutor effects are always good. And you know what? An aggro deck trying to pick up another creature is not a bad thing. This thing comes in as a 1/1, not super exciting. But if I'm grabbing another important creature, yeah, it's actually good enough to play, no doubt. Now, the reason it's a mythic, if you don't know the history of it, is it's a very rare card. It was hard to find, had a high price point attached to it, so they went ahead and made it mythic here, gave it some new art too, which actually looks pretty cool. And yeah, it's very runnable in a deck where you're trying to go wide or trying to be aggressive. So especially good, again, probably in red-white, red-black, more than anything. Irish Shaman. This is a good beater. 2/1 Menace for 2. Now we're talking about a card that you want to grab some copies of. It's uncommon, but you'll be able to find some again. And even if you're not in a really all-in aggro deck, this is still just a solid creature. It also has Megamorph. Sometimes it's a 3/2, so that's actually kind of cool with Menace. Oh, and by the way, when this is turned face up, if you use the Megamorph, then you get to exile the top card of your library and perhaps play that card, which is pretty awesome. Again, a lot of times red needs to keep the cards flowing, and this will help you do that. Izzet Chemistry. I mentioned earlier there's not a lot of instant sorcery matters cards in this set. There's a couple in red, and sure, they might be good in the Izzet colors, but they're not really primarily what red's trying to do. Here's one of them. It's a rare, though. You won't see it a lot. So I might play this in Izzet in some builds if I have a lot of instants and sorceries, which I probably will in those colors. You might find some value here. The only problem is it's a little slow. And yes, it can lead to some big plays. Don't get me wrong. Like imagine doing Cinder Storm twice, right? Thanks to this card. That could be kind of awesome. The problem is it's slow enough that your opponent's going to see it coming and they have a chance to respond to it. If they can't respond to it, though, you're having a good day. But if they do, you could get blown out. Especially if you get greedy and try to put a bunch of spells on this thing, they're not going to be having it. Eventually it goes away, unfortunately. And if it happens before you can actually sacrifice it, that's not going to feel great. Jackal Pup. Welcome to Pauper, Jackal Pup. First time in common. This card was powerful back in its day. I mean, I know nowadays you look at 2/1s for 1 with drawbacks, and you're kind of like, yeah, that's okay. But back in the day, this was really, really strong for red. And it still is in this environment, as a matter of fact. Exactly what red's trying to do here. 2/1 for 1, just power across damage early on. Works well with Boros, so you could play these with Savannah Lions, for example. Again, you have that weird synergy with Darien if you happen to get that too, which is kind of nice. But for the most part, you're not concerned about taking damage from this card because it's all about racing and winning the race. That's what red's trying to do. Kindle. This is actually a good spell, even if you only grab one of these. 2 casting cost, instant speed, 2 to a creature or player. You got the versatility there. Yeah. Sign me up. I'll run this all day long. The thing you have to remember, though, this gets better if you have multiple copies. So especially for draft, you could exploit that a little bit. Sometimes you'll get a couple copies in your sealed pool, too. Beyond that, though, one thing you got to remember, it actually checks the number of cards in all graveyards. That includes your opponent. So if your opponent's playing these, you get a little advantage off the ones in their graveyard, but also vice versa. So sometimes game 1 happens, you might have one of these in your deck. If your opponent's pulling out 2 or 3, you might want to think about boarding yours out, perhaps. Again, you're getting the advantage off the ones they play too, so maybe it's still fine for you, but they might get more advantage in the long run if they're running multiple copies of this thing. So just keep that in mind. It's an interesting kind of side game you have to make note of, but overall, it's just a really good card. Lightning Bolt. Yeah, it's good. Play it. Next card. So I don't have a lot to say about Lightning Bolt. You're going to play it no matter what your build is. Super economical, 1 casting cost, instant speed, target creature or player, 3 damage. It's going to deal with a lot of threats on the board. It can go to the face to deal damage to your opponent. It's a significant amount of damage at 3. One of the best cards ever printed. Doesn't matter if you're an aggro deck or not, just play the thing. Magus of the Wheel. This one's kind of funny because, again, I feel like they're trying to bring the nostalgia of Wheel of Fortune in, but again, they can't do that because of the reserve list, so we get this one. Usually when you think of cards like this, at least for Constructed, you think of like Storm and things of that nature, but of course you don't have that in this limited environment. What you do have, though, are aggro decks that need to refuel, and this will help you. If you're all in on aggro and you're concerned about running out of gas, this is actually pretty good for you. It's also a 3/3 creature for 3. That's significant considering this set. Sometimes it's hard to find sizable creatures. It is a rare, but still. If you have this thing, sometimes just a 3/3 for 3 might not be bad for you. But remember, it's a reciprocal ability. Your opponent's going to get restocked too. That could be problematic. The trick is, again, having a deck where it's going to be better for you than them. Aggro decks are a good example of that because, again, you can hopefully dump your hand. Also, too, it costs 2 to activate this thing, and you have to sack the card. And keep in mind that you don't want to necessarily play this and have not enough mana left over to cast your things. You don't want your opponent to have first crack at casting the cards that they're getting. You really want to be able to put down at least one thing from this. So make sure you have extra mana when you activate it so you can play something that you got and just stay ahead of your opponent in that way. Mog Flunkies, another super good card. I mean, just great aggro. You want to have a lot of creatures or you don't play this. If you're in a more tight creature deck and perhaps, for example, might not have a lot of creatures. Or you're in a case where Gruul, but you're trying to ramp into larger things or something like that. Then this is not as good. But when you're thinking, again, especially Boros, where you know you're going to have a lot of small creatures coming, then this is going to be phenomenal for you at 2, and it's a great beater. At common, too. Pillage. Fantastic, fantastic card here. 3 casting costs, land removal is going to be good for you. Destroy target artifact or land, can't be regenerated. Very simple card, but it can really mean the difference sometimes between a fair game of Magic and making your opponent stumble because they kept a hand that was really reliant on a particular color mana or a particular number of lands. You can steal a game with this, pure and simple. Now, later in the game, it's not an exciting draw anymore, and that's the downside of it. But if you can draw one of these early, then you could perhaps just kind of win and just make your opponent stumble, which is kind of crazy to think for 3 mana. But this card is actually that good. If for some reason you don't main deck it, because let's consider you're in an all-in aggro deck, sometimes you might not care about taking your opponent off their land that much. You might be more concerned about just keeping pressure on turn 3 and turn 4, and that's probably the right way to go in some builds. So if you're not playing this, but then your opponent comes in with a problematic artifact or land, then you might want to sideboard it in. So always keep that in mind. Don't forget it's there for you. But in most builds, you're going to be good. Another reason you might side this in is if you see your opponent getting a little bit greedy with color. They're trying to go 3 or splash a 4th color or something like that. Then this could be really punishing for them. Also, another card in red that is joining Pauper for the first time is it sees a common printing. So that's important to note as well. Pyre Hound. Here's another card that kind of is dependent on instants and sorceries. It's not a bad creature, though. A 2/3 for 4 is like, okay, and it's got trample. But it gets +1/+1 counters based on casting instants and sorceries, when you do it anyway. So that's actually kind of sweet because it's not just end of turn. I mean, it's a permanent thing, and that's kind of awesome. Perhaps this is best in Izzet colors, but I could see this being good for you if you just have a few instants and sorceries to buff this along the way. Pyroclasm. This is really good in this set. There's so many small creatures that you can deal with this thing. Now, the big question is this going to hurt me more than it hurts my opponent? There's times where that could happen. So if I'm in the aggro deck and I'm playing a lot of small creatures, do I truly, truly want this? I still wouldn't be against playing 1, even though it could slow you down a little bit from putting pressure on sometimes. But it is a panic button. So if things aren't going your way, in this particular set especially, this could dig you out of a hole, and that's kind of cool. Because also you know it's coming, so you can hold your stuff back, maybe make your opponent overcommit a little bit, and turn the tables. That is not a bad thing at all. Now, this gets better in some ways when you start looking at other decks, like the Izzet deck, where you might be playing less creatures and trying to control the board more. Then it becomes really strong there. It could be even good if you're in Gruul and you're playing larger creatures, and that way it won't affect you as much as it could affect an opponent. And if you're not main decking it for some reason and get beat down in game 1, then of course you can bring it in. And it's very splashable too at 1 red, so very strong card here. Red Elemental Blast. Sideboard card, obviously, because it only targets blue. But if you're sitting across the table from a blue player, guess what? You're going to bring this in because this card is phenomenal. Counter target blue spell or destroy target blue permanent for just 1 red at instant speed. Yeah, this is an awesome color hoser. Simian Spirit Guide. This is a good constructed card. Maybe not always super exciting, though, in the world of Limited. It's a 2/2 for 3, which isn't fantastic. I mean, it's a curve filler if you need it. And the reason I would exile this thing to get an extra red mana, I mean, I'm trying to push my mana a little harder. Maybe a Gruul deck might want to do that if they have some more expensive, bigger things that they're concerned about getting out. And maybe you don't have the best ramp just in green, so it could complement that a little bit. I could see playing it there. A lot of times, though, I think I skip this one because, again, red is just so economical. I don't know how much extra mana I need, especially at the cost of a card like this, honestly. Skeleton Eyes. This, of course, is better in Rakdos colors because of the fact that you could regenerate the token, which is very good. A 1/1 regenerating token is really annoying. Like, your opponent has a hard time getting past that with their big stuff sometimes. Beyond that, it's also an instant speed, dealing 3 damage to a creature spell, and that's always a good thing too. Can't hit an opponent in this case, but that's fine. You can hit a creature and deal with problems that maybe you don't have a better answer to, and also get yourself potentially a very persistent blocker. So for 5 mana, yeah, this is pretty good. Sign me up. This is also another card that has entered the World of Pauper for the first time. Skirk Commando. This is a decent card. I mean, on paper, like a 3 casting cost 2 on color 2/1 doesn't sound great, but I'm happy with the morph ability here. I get a 2/2 for 3, tack in, maybe surprise my opponent and destroy one of their small creatures at some point. That's actually kind of cool. Now, granted, if they have a small creature that they care about, this is great. If they have small creatures they don't care about, then you're probably just going to trade, and you have to be aware of that. But if you can just get in there and take out something that's more problematic, that's a low casting cost, like a Hell's Caretaker or something like that, that could be really good and actually be a really big play. So it's not always going to be amazing, but it's good utility. There's also times that they have a creature, and this is face up, that they don't want to lose its low toughness, then it might cause them to hold back their attacks a little bit too. Soulbright Flamekin. I used to love this card when it was in Lorwyn originally in Limited. I played this like all the time. It's commons, you'll find these. You're not getting a lot of extra mana. Like, you could activate this the 3 times and get the extra mana, but you're only netting yourself 2 mana. But it is all red, so that could be relevant some of the time. So I'm not really playing this because I care too much about the mana, unless maybe I'm trying to cast a Chroma or something like that, perhaps. But even then, this isn't probably the best way to do that. Now, aside from that, though, giving stuff trample is really good, especially if you're in Gruul colors. You have larger creatures that need to get their damage across. This will be really, really good for you there. And still a 2/1 for 2. If you need a creature that can beat down, it can still beat down too. Spike Shot Goblin. This was very powerful in Mirrodin Limited. Not as much here. It's still really good though. But the difference was Mirrodin Limited had so many equipment spells that could just super buff this thing quickly. And then you were just blowing everything up. Just blowing up creatures, going to your opponent's face with this thing. It was incredible. It's still good here, don't get me wrong, but you're going to have to work a little harder for it to be great because you can buff this thing with some auras. That's an option. There is a piece of equipment that gives it +1/+1. Nothing like you find in Mirrodin, though. So there are some options here. It's definitely playable. It is a very, very strong card under the right circumstances. Thresher Lizard. This is a more contemporary card from Amonkhet, and it feels more contemporary, right? A 3/2 for 3. Those are some pretty nice stats, especially in this set that becomes ultra powerful sometimes. So you're going to be happy to run this thing most of the time, I think. It's like common, these will be floating around. Beyond that, especially for aggro decks, once you get down, you start to run out of gas, you get a little buff here, making this thing a 4/4 that can be very sizable in this format. So really good common creature here, especially for the Boros and the Rakdos builds. Trumpet Blast. Talk about getting damage across when you go wide. Attacking creatures get +2/+0 till end of turn, just for 3 mana at instant speed, so you can surprise your opponent too. Use it as a combat trick in a pinch, or hopefully finish off a game. Perfect for what White-Red's trying to do. Perfect. Good in Black-Red too. I mean, wherever you have the opportunity to go wide, this card is going to be phenomenal. It's also good in Gruul colors as well, because you are going to have some of the big creatures. Maybe they have trample some of the time. And again, you can just push across more damage, even if you're not as wide. Although there's some token creation in green too. So between the red and green token creation, maybe you just go wide enough for this to matter. So very, very good pickup here for sure. This is a card that You could even pick up early and try to build around and just go with one of those go-wide strategies. Uncage Fury, fantastic combat trick here, sometimes can even put away a game. This is the type of card that is an instant for 3 that can really surprise your opponent. That double strike can be a big deal. +1/+1 and double strike. You put that on a large creature, especially you trample, that could be a blowout. This probably gets a little better in Gruul again because you do have more sizable creatures. But even so, really fine combat trick. Also really good in lieu of a removal spell. If you're lacking on removal for whatever reason, this can be just as good for you sometimes. Zeta Hedron Grinder. Busted down to uncommon from rare. A legendary uncommon, and we see quite a few of that in the set actually. Now, this card is great in this set. A 3/3 for 4. First off, nice stats in this particular set especially. Beyond that, there's so many cool things you can do because, again, there's so many go-wide strategies. Boros can go really wide quickly. Black, maybe not as fast, but also has a lot of opportunities. Even Gruul, like I mentioned, has some opportunities. So imagine playing the previous card on this. That could be crazy. I mean, that could just be game-winning. Just that quickly. That's awesome. Also, even like in green, you have like Giant Growth. There's just so many options here. This card is going to be strong for you in the limited game, no doubt. All right, let's move on to Multicolor with Rurik Thar the Embowed. Great card if you can pick this thing up. One thing I want to warn you about, though, whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, this will deal 6 damage to that player, so that includes you. But if you're in Gruul colors, you can orchestrate a very creature-heavy deck and have this affect you less than it will hopefully affect your opponent, and that's really the idea here. There is another drawback, too, though. It is a 6/6 creature, very sizable. It has Vigilance and Reach, which is awesome, too, and you're getting a lot here for 6 mana, considering this particular set has a lot of smaller creatures. So this is awesome. However, it does have to attack every combat, so you have a situation now where you're forced to attack with this thing. It has Vigilance, so you can still defend, that's nice. But your opponent is probably going to joint block to try to get this thing off the battlefield, most of the time. It's still really good against Izzet, though, because Izzet might not have that luxury. They might not have enough creatures on the battlefield to take this thing out a lot of the time, and they are running a lot of instants and sorceries. So if Burn is like their plan, control Burn, they're probably in trouble if this card hits the battlefield. But it's not going to necessarily win you the game. But worst case scenario, it might give you a 2-for-1 trade if they just double block against it or something like that. Staying. Now, this is old school. We're talking about Legends here. This card's never been reprinted, so it's actually kind of cool to see it with the new art. It also has a twin token, which is super sweet. But it is another legendary uncommon, and it's a good card. I mean, it's basically 6/8 power toughness on the battlefield for 6 mana. It's split, and you do have to remember, if you lose one, you kind of lose the other, so there's that. But it's still really decent, especially within this set for building out your board state a little bit. It helps you go wide, so it contributes to that type of strategy, but it also gives you some heft as well. Boros Charm, as we move into Boros colors. Powerful, powerful. One of the most powerful charms, if not the most powerful, honestly. Does everything red and white wants to do here. I mean, it can do 4 damage to a player, so it kind of fits into the whole burn strategy. Permanents you control gain indestructible till end of turn, protects you against board sweeps, maybe even a board sweep you're doing yourself, because you have a Chroma's Vengeance, for example, in white. That could be pretty sweet. And even just a combat situation that gets problematic, and maybe you're just pushing across damage and you want to create an atmosphere where maybe your opponent thinks you're going to do a lot of trades and then you surprise them with this. Or even just simply your opponent has combat tricks and you counter it with this, that can help you. And then finally, target creature gaining double strike. Again, that can be really good for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, especially on larger creatures. So that's also a nice combat trick to use, but also could get your opponent down to low life levels if they're not expecting it. Bryon Stout Arm. Okay, this is a legendary creature that did stay at rare, and for good reason. It's a great one. 4 casting costs, 4/4, lifelink, and oh, by the way, you can start flinging stuff at opponents. So this is going to be phenomenal when you have an opportunity to play it. I mentioned earlier, too, there is a card that can allow you to sacrifice creatures that's not in black, and this is it, actually. You can play maybe like that Act of Treason or something and get extra value out of it if you have this in play. Your opponent's going to have to find an answer to this. And especially in these colors, you're going to have plenty of things to throw around. All right, one more card today. Another Boros card, a bonus one. It's the Gisela Blade of Cold Night. This one's a mythic. You won't see it very often, but if you do, play it. It's actually not that hard to cast either, because it's only 2 white and red and then 4, which, I mean, it's sizable. It's going to take a little time to get there, but once this thing hits the battlefield, if your opponent doesn't have an answer for it, you're probably just winning. Flying, first strike, cutting damage against you and your stuff in half while doubling damage against your opponent and their stuff. That's actually kind of crazy, right? So this card is a powerhouse. I'm sure if you played with it before, you're aware of that, but yes, this is going to be really good. And again, if you're going wide, this could impact a number of creatures on the battlefield at any given time. And Boros is all about going wide, so this is just a very powerful punch if you get it on the battlefield and it can survive. Alright, with that being said, those are the cards for today. Tomorrow we're going to be back with Part 5. We're going to look at all of the green cards. And then the next day, we're going to wrap things up with the colorless cards. So we're actually getting there. But until next time, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.